First they spoke of her illness, although Emma interrupted Charles from time to time, for fear, she said, of boring Monsieur Léon, and the latter told them that he had come to spend 2 years at Rouen in a large office, in order to get practice in his profession, which was different in Normandy and Paris. Then he inquired after Berthe, the Mère Lefrançois, and as they had, in the husband's presence, nothing more to say to one another, the conversation soon came to an end. People coming out of the theatre passed along the pavement, humming or shouting at the top of their voices, "Oh Belange, ma Lucie!" Then Léon, playing the dilettante, began to choke music. He had seen Tambrini, Rubini, Pergiani, Grisi, and, compared with them, Lagardy, despite his grand outbursts, was nowhere. "Oh beautiful angel, my Lucie!" "Yet," interrupted Charles, who was slowly sipping his rum sherbet, "they say that he is quite admirable in the last act. I regret leaving before the end, because it was beginning to amuse me." "Why," said a clerk, "he will soon give another performance." But Charles replied that they were going back next day. "Unless," he added, turning to his wife, "you would like to stay alone, kitten." And changing his tactics at this unexpected opportunity that presented itself to his hopes, the young man sang the praises of Lagardy in the last number. It was really superb, sublime. Then Charles insisted, "You would get back on Sunday. Come, make up your mind. You are wrong if you feel that this is doing you the least good." The tables round them, however, were emptying. A waiter came and stood discreetly near them. Charles, who understood, took out his purse. The clerk held back his arm and did not forget to leave 2 more pieces of silver that he made chink on the marble. "I am really sorry," said Bovary, "about the money which you are The other made a careless gesture full of cordiality, and taking his hat, said "It is settled, isn't it? Tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Charles explained once more that he could not absent himself longer, but that nothing prevented Emma But she stammered, with a strange smile, "I am not sure "Well, you must think it over. We'll see. Night brings counsel." Then to Léon, who was walking along with them, "Now that you are in our part of the world, I hope you'll come and ask us for some dinner now and then." The clerk declared he would not fail to do so, being obliged, moreover, to go to Yonville on some business for his office. And they parted before the St. Herland passage just as the clock in the cathedral struck 11:30. Part 3. Chapter 1. Monsieur Léon, while studying law, had gone pretty often to the dancing rooms, where he was even a great success amongst the grisettes, who thought he had a distinguished air. He was the best mannered of the students. He wore his hair neither too long nor too short, didn't spend all his quarter's money on the first day of the month, and kept on good terms with his professors. As for excesses, he had always abstained from them, as much from cowardice as from refinement. Often when he stayed in his room to read, or else when sitting of an evening under the lime trees of the Luxembourg, he let his coat fall to the ground, and the memory of Emma came back to him. But gradually this feeling grew weaker, and other desires gathered over it, although it still persisted through them all. For Léon did not lose all hope. There was for him, as it were, a vague promise floating in the future, like a golden fruit suspended from some fantastic tree. Then, seeing her again after 3 years of absence, his passion reawakened. He must, he thought, at last make up his mind to possess her. Moreover, his timidity had worn off by contact with his gay companions, and he returned to the provinces despising everyone who had not with varnished shoes trodden the asphalt of the boulevards. By the side of a Parisian in her laces, in the drawing-room of some illustrious physician, a person driving his carriage and wearing many orders. The poor clerk would no doubt have trembled like a child, but here at Rouen, on the harbor, with the wife of this small doctor, he felt at his ease, sure beforehand he would shine. Self-possession depends on its environment. We don't speak on the first floor as on the fourth, and the wealthy woman seems to have about her, to guard her virtue, all her banknotes, like a cuirass in the lining of her corset. On leaving the Bovarys the night before, Leon had followed them through the streets at a distance, then having seen them stop at the Croix Rouge, he turned on his heel and spent the night meditating a plan. So the next day about 5 o'clock he walked into the kitchen of the inn with a choking sensation in his throat, pale cheeks, and that resolution of cowards that stops at nothing. "The gentleman isn't in," answered a servant. This seemed to him a good omen. He went upstairs. She was not disturbed at his approach. On the contrary, she apologized for having neglected to tell him where they were staying. "Oh, I divined it," said Leon. He pretended he had been guided towards her by chance, by instinct. She began to smile, and at once, to repair his folly, Leon told her that he had spent his morning in looking for her in all the hotels in the town, one after the other. "So you have made up your mind to stay?" he added. "Yes," she said, "and I am wrong. One ought not to accustom oneself to impossible pleasures when there are 1,000 demands upon one." "Oh, I can't imagine." No, for you are a man." But men too had had their trials, and the conversation went off into certain philosophical reflections. Emma expatiated much on the misery of earthly affections, and the eternal isolation in which the heart remains entombed. To show off, or from a naive imitation of this melancholy which called forth the young man declared that he had been awfully bored during the whole course of his studies. The law irritated him, other vocations attracted him, and his mother never ceased worrying him in every one of her letters. As they talked they explained more and more fully the motives of their sadness, working themselves up in their progressive confidence. But they sometimes stopped short of the complete exposition of their thought, and then sought to invent a phrase that might express it all the same. She did not confess her passion for another, he did not say that he had forgotten her. Perhaps he no longer remembered his suppers with girls after masked balls, and no doubt she did not recollect the rendezvous of old when she ran across the fields in the morning to her lover's house. The noises of a town hardly reached them, and the room seemed small, as if on purpose to hem in their solitude more closely. Emma, in a dimity dressing gown, leaned her head against the back of the old armchair. The yellow wallpaper formed, as it were, a golden background behind her, and her bare head was mirrored in the glass with the white parting in the middle and the tip of her ears peeping out from the folds of her hair. "But pardon me," she said. "It is wrong of me. I weary you with my eternal complaints." "No, never, never. If you knew," she went on, raising to the ceiling her beautiful eyes in which a tear was trembling, "all that I had dreamed. And I too have suffered. Often I went out, I went away. I dragged myself along the quays, seeking distraction amid the din of the crowd without being able to banish the heaviness that weighed upon me. In an engraver's shop on the boulevard there is an Italian print of one of the muses. She is draped in a tunic, and she is looking at the moon, with forget-me-nots in her flowing hair. Something drove me there. Continually I stayed there hours together. Then in a trembling voice, she resembled you a little." Madame Bovary turned away her head that he might not see the irrepressible smile she felt rising to her lips. "Often," he went on, "I wrote you letters that I tore up. She did not answer. He continued. I sometimes fancied that some chance would bring you. I thought I recognized you at street corners, and I ran after all the carriages, through whose windows I saw a shawl fluttering, a veil like yours. She seemed resolved to let him go on speaking without interruption. Crossing her arms and bending down her face, she looked at the rosettes on her slippers and at intervals made little movements inside the satin of them with her toes. At last she sighed. But the most wretched thing, is it not, is to drag out, as I do, a useless existence. If our pains were only of some use to someone, we should find consolation in the thought of the sacrifice. He started off in praise of virtue, duty, and silent immolation, having himself an incredible longing for self-sacrifice that he could not satisfy. I should much like, she said, to be a nurse at a hospital. Alas! Men have none of these holy missions, and I see nowhere any calling unless perhaps that of a doctor. With a slight shrug of her shoulders, Emma interrupted him to speak of her illness, which had almost killed her. What a pity! She should not be suffering now. Leon at once envied the calm of the tomb, and one evening he had even made his will, asking to be buried in that beautiful rug with velvet stripes he had received from her. For this was how they would have wished to be, each setting up an ideal to which they were now adapting their past life. Besides, speech is a rolling mill that always thins out the sentiment. But at this invention of the rug she asked, "But why?" "Why?" He hesitated. "Because I loved you so." And congratulating himself at having surmounted the difficulty, Leon watched her face out of the corner of his eyes. It was like the sky when a gust of wind drives the clouds across. The mass of sad thoughts that darkened them seemed to be lifted from her blue eyes. Her whole face shone. He waited. At last she replied, "I always suspected it." Then they went over all the trifling events of that far-off existence, whose joys and sorrows they had just summed up in one word. They recalled the arbor with clematis, the dresses she had worn, the furniture of her room, the whole of her house. "And our poor cactuses, where are they? The cold killed them this winter." "Ah, how I have thought of them, do you know? I often saw them again as of yore, when on the summer mornings the sun beat down upon your blinds, and I saw your two bare arms passing out amongst the flowers." "Poor friend," she said, holding out her hand to him. Leon swiftly pressed his lips to it. Then, when he had taken a deep breath, "At that time you were to me I know not what incomprehensible force that took captive my life. Once, for instance, I went to see you, but you, no doubt, do not remember it." "I do," she said. "Go on." "You were downstairs in the anteroom ready to go out, standing on the last stair. You were wearing a bonnet with small blue flowers, and, without any invitation from you, in spite of myself, I went with you. Every moment, however, I grew more and more conscious of my folly, and I went on walking by you, not daring to follow you completely, and unwilling to leave you. When you went into a shop, I waited in the street and I watched you through the window taking off your gloves and counting the change on the counter. Then you rang at Madame Tuvatch's. You were let in, and I stood like an idiot in front of the great heavy door that had closed after you." Madame Bovary, as she listened to him, wondered that she was so old. All these things reappearing before her seemed to widen out her life. It was like some sentimental immensity to which she returned, and from time to time she said in a low voice, her eyes half closed, "Yes, it is true. They heard 8 strike on the different clocks of the Beauvoisin quarter, which is full of schools, churches, and large empty hotels. They no longer spoke, but they felt as they looked upon each other a buzzing in their heads as if something sonorous had escaped from the fixed eyes of each of them. They were hand in hand now, and the past, the future, reminiscences and dreams, all were confounded in the sweetness of this ecstasy. Night was darkening over the walls, on which still shone, half hidden in the shade, the coarse colors of 4 bills, representing 4 scenes from the Bovary Nestle, with a motto in Spanish and French at the bottom. Through the sash window a patch of dark sky was seen between the pointed roofs. She rose to light 2 wax candles on the drawers, then she sat down again. "Well," said Leon. "Well," she replied. He was thinking how to resume the interrupted conversation, when she said to him, "How is it that no one until now has ever expressed such sentiments to you?" "Me." The clerk said that ideal natures were difficult to understand. He from the first moment had loved her, and he despaired when he thought of the happiness that would have been theirs, if thanks to fortune, meeting her. Earlier, they had been indissolubly bound to one another. "I have sometimes thought of it," she went on. "What a dream," murmured Leon. And fingering gently the blue binding of her long white sash, he added, "And who prevents us from beginning now?" "No, my friend," she replied. "I am too old, you are too young. Forget me. Others will love you, you will love them." "Not as you," he cried. "What a child you are. Come, let us be sensible. I wish it." She showed him the impossibility of their love, and that they must remain, as formerly, on the simple terms of a fraternal friendship. Was she speaking thus seriously? No doubt Emma did not herself know, quite absorbed as she was by the charm of the seduction, and the necessity of defending herself from it, and contemplating the young man with a moved look. She gently repulsed the timid caresses that his trembling hands attempted. Forgive me," he cried, drawing back. Emma was seized with a vague fear at this shyness, more dangerous to her than the boldness of Rodolphe when he advanced to her open-armed. No man had ever seemed to her so beautiful. An exquisite candor emanated from his being. He lowered his long fine eyelashes, that curled upwards. His cheek with the soft skin reddened, she thought, with desire of her person, and Emma felt an invincible longing to press her lips to it. Then, leaning towards the clock as if to see the time, "How late it is," she said. "How we do chatter." He understood the hint and took up his hat. "It has even made me forget the theatre. And poor Bovary has left me here especially for that. Monsieur Lormeau, of the Rue Grand Pont, was to take me and his wife. And the opportunity was lost, as she was to leave the next day." "Really?" said Leon. "Yes. But I must see you again," he went on. "I wanted to tell you What?" "Something important, serious." "Oh, no. Besides, you will not go. It is impossible. If you should listen to me, then you have not understood me, you have not guessed Yet you speak plainly," said Emma. You can jest. Enough. Enough. Oh, for pity's sake, let me see you. Once, only once." "Well, she stopped, then, as if thinking better of it. "Oh, not here." "Where you will." "Will you she seemed to reflect, then abruptly. "Tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the cathedral." "I shall be there," he cried, seizing her hands, which she disengaged. And as they were both standing up, he behind her, and Emma with her head bent, he stooped over her and pressed long kisses on her neck. "You are mad." You are mad," she said, with sounding little laughs, while the kisses multiplied. Then bending his head over her shoulder, he seemed to beg the consent of her eyes. They fell upon him full of an icy dignity. Leon stepped back to go out. He stopped on the threshold, then he whispered with a trembling voice, "Tomorrow." She answered with a nod, and disappeared like a bird into the next room. In the evening Emma wrote the clerk an interminable letter, in which she cancelled the rendezvous. All was over. They must not, for the sake of their happiness, meet again. But when the letter was finished, as she did not know Leon's address, she was puzzled. "I'll give it to him myself," she said. "He will come." The next morning, at the open window, and humming on his balcony, Leon himself varnished his bumps with several coatings. He put on white trousers, fine socks, a green coat, emptied all the scent he had into his handkerchief. Then, having had his hair curled, he uncurled it again, in order to give it a more natural elegance. "It is still too early," he thought, looking at the hairdresser's cuckoo clock, that pointed to the hour of 9. He read an old-fashioned journal, went out, smoked a cigar, walked up 3 streets, thought it was time, and went slowly towards the porch of Notre Dame. It was a beautiful summer morning. Silver plate sparkled in the jewelers' windows, and the light falling obliquely on the cathedral made mirrors of the corners of the grey stones. A flock of birds fluttered in the grey sky round the trefoil bell turrets. The square, resounding with cries, was fragrant with the flowers that bordered its pavement: roses, jasmines, pinks, narcissi, and tuberoses, unevenly spaced out between moist grasses, mint and chickweed for the birds. The fountains gurgled in the center, and under large umbrellas, amidst melons piled up in heaps, flower women, bareheaded, were twisting paper-round bunches of violets. The young man took one. It was the first time that he had bought flowers for a woman, and his breast, as he smelled them, swelled with pride, as if this homage that he meant for another had recoiled upon himself. But he was afraid of being seen. He resolutely entered the church. The beadle, who was just then standing on the threshold in the middle of the left doorway, under the dancing Mary Ann, with feather cap and rapier dangling against his calves, came in, more majestic than a cardinal, and as shining as a saint on a holy pikes. He came towards Leon, and, with that smile of wheedling benignity assumed by ecclesiastics when they question children, "The gentleman, no doubt, does not belong to these parts? The gentleman would like to see the curiosities of the church?" "No," said the other. And he first went round the lower aisles. Then he went out to look at the place. Emma was not coming yet. He went up again to the choir. The nave was reflected in the full fonts with the beginning of the arches and some portions of the glass windows. But the reflections of the paintings, broken by the marble rim, were continued farther on upon the flagstones, like a many-colored carpet. The broad daylight from without streamed into the church in 3 enormous rays from the 3 open portals. From time to time at the upper end a sacristan passed, making the oblique genuflection of devout persons in a hurry. The crystal lustres hung motionless. In the choir a silver lamp was burning, and from the side chapels and dark places of the church sometimes rose sounds like sighs, with the clong of a closing grating, its echo reverberating under the lofty vault. Leon with solemn steps walked along by the walls. Life had never seemed so good to him. She would come directly, charming, agitated, looking back at the glances that followed her, and with her flounced dress, her gold eyeglass, her thin shoes, with all sorts of elegant trifles that he had never enjoyed, and with the ineffable seduction of yielding virtue. The church like a huge boudoir spread around her, the arches bent down to gather in the shade the confession of her love. The windows shone resplendent to illumine her face, and the censers would burn that she might appear like an angel amid the fumes of the sweet-smelling odd hours. But she did not come. He sat down on a chair, and his eyes fell upon a blue-stained window representing boatmen carrying baskets. He looked at it long, attentively, and he counted the scales of the fishes and the buttonholes of the doublets, while his thoughts wandered off towards Emma. The beadle, standing aloof, was inwardly angry at this individual who took the liberty of admiring the cathedral by himself. He seemed to him to be conducting himself in a monstrous fashion, to be robbing him in a sort, and almost committing sacrilege. But a rustle of silk on the flags, the tip of a bonnet, a lined cloak, it was she. Leon rose and ran to meet her. Emma was pale. She walked fast. "Read," she said, holding out a paper to him. "Oh, no." And she abruptly withdrew her hand to enter the chapel of the Virgin, where, kneeling on a chair, she began to pray. The young man was irritated at this bigot fancy. Then he nevertheless experienced a certain charm in seeing her, in the middle of a rendezvous, thus lost in her devotions, like an Andalusian marchioness. Then he grew bored, for she seemed never coming to an end. Emma prayed, or rather strove to pray, hoping that some sudden resolution might descend to her from heaven, and to draw down divine aid. She filled full her eyes with the splendors of the tabernacle. She breathed in the perfumes of the full-blown flowers in the large vases, and listened to the stillness of the church, that only heightened the tumult of her heart. She rose, and they were about to leave, when the beadle came forward, hurriedly saying, "Madam, no doubt, does not belong to these parts? Madam would like to see the curiosities of the church?" "Oh, no," cried the clerk. "Why not?" said she. For she clung with her expiring virtue to the Virgin, the sculptures, the tombs, anything. Then, in order to proceed, by rule, the beadle conducted them right to the entrance near the square, where, pointing out with his cane a large circle of block stones without inscription or carving, "This," he said majestically, "is the circumference of the beautiful Bell of Ambroise. It weighed 40,000 pounds. There was not its equal in all Europe. The workman who cast it died of the joy. Let us go on," said Leon. The old fellow started off again. Then, having got back to the chapel of the Virgin, he stretched forth his arm with an all-embracing gesture of demonstration, and prouder than a country squire showing you his espaliers, went on. "This simple stone covers Pierre Ibres, Lord of Varon and of Brissac, Grand Marshal of Poitou, and Governor of Normandy, who died at the Battle of Montelhary on the 16th of July, 1465. Leon bit his lips, fuming. "And on the right, this gentleman all encased in iron, on the prancing horse, is his grandson, Louis d'Ibres, Lord of Bravallon of Montchauvet, Count de Maulevrier, Baron de Moigny, Chamberlain to the King, Knight of the Order, and also Governor of Normandy, died on the 23rd of July, 1531, a Sunday, as the inscription specifies, and below, this figure, about to descend into the tomb, portrays the same person. It is not possible, is it, to see a more perfect representation of annihilation." Madame Bovary put up her eyeglasses. Leon, motionless, looked at her, no longer even attempting to speak a single word, to make a gesture, so discouraged was he at this twofold obstinacy of gossip and indifference. The everlasting guide went on. Near him, this kneeling woman who weeps as his spouse, Diane de Poitiers, Countess d'Ibres, Duchess de Valentinois, born in 1499, died in 1566, and to the left, the one with the child, is the Holy Virgin. Now, turn to this side. Here are the tombs of the Ambroise. They were both cardinals and archbishops of Rouen. That one was minister under Louis XII. He did a great deal for the cathedral. In his will he left 30,000 gold crowns for the poor. And without stopping, still talking, He pushed them into a chapel, full of balustrades, some put away, and disclosed a kind of block that certainly might once have been an ill-made statue. Truly, he said with a groan, it adorned the tomb of Richard Coeur, Lion, King of England and Duke of Normandy. It was the Calvinists, sir, who reduced it to this condition. They had buried it full spite in the earth under the episcopal seat of Monsignor. See, this is the door by which Monsignor passes to his house. Let us pass on quickly to see the gargoyle windows. But Leon hastily took some silver from his pocket and seized Emma's arm. The beadle stood dumbfounded, not able to understand this untimely munificence when there were still so many things for the stranger to see. So calling him back, he cried, Sir, sir, the steeple, the steeple. No, thank you, said Leon. You are wrong, sir. It is 440 feet high, 9 less than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It is all cast, Leon was fleeing, for it seemed to him that his love, that for nearly 2 hours now had become petrified in the church like the stones, would vanish like a vapor through that sort of truncated funnel of oblong cage of open chimney that rises so grotesquely from the cathedral like the extravagant attempt of some fantastic brazier. But where are we going? She said. Making no answer, he walked on with a rapid step, and Madame Bovary was already dipping her finger in the holy water when behind them they heard a panting breath interrupted by the regular sound of a cane. Leon turned back. Sir. What is it? And he recognized the beadle holding under his arms and balancing against his stomach some 20 large sewn volumes. They were works which treated of the cathedral. Idiot! Growled Leon, rushing out of the church. A lad was playing about the close. Go and get me a cab. The child bounded off like a ball by the Rue Quatre-Vents. Then they were alone a few minutes, face to face, and a little embarrassed. Leon? Really, I don't know if I ought, she whispered. Then with a more serious air, do you know, it is very improper. How so? Replied the clerk. It is done at Paris. And that, as an irresistible argument, decided her. Still the cab did not come. Leon was afraid she might go back into the church. At last the cab appeared. At all events, go out by the north porch, cried the beadle, who was left alone on the threshold, so as to see the resurrection, the last judgment, paradise, King David, and the condemned in hell flames. Where to, sir? Asked the coachman. Where you like, said Leon, forcing Emma into the cab. And the lumbering machine set out. It went down the Rue Grand Pont, crossed the Place des Arts, the Quai Napoleon, the Pont Neuf, and stopped short before the statue of Pierre Corneille. Go on, cried a voice that came from within. The cab went on again, and as soon as it reached the Carrefour, Lafayette set off downhill and entered the station at a gallop. No, straight on, cried the same voice. The cab came out by the gate, and soon having reached the Quais, trotted quietly beneath the elm trees. The coachman wiped his brow, put his leather hat between his knees, and drove his carriage beyond the side alley by the meadow to the margin of the waters. It went along by the river, along the towing path paved with sharp pebbles, and for a long while in the direction of Oisel, beyond the Isles. But suddenly it turned with a dash across Quatre-Mers, Sotteville, La Grande Chaussee, the Rue d'Elbeuf, and made its third halt in front of the Jardin des Plantes. Get on, will you? Cried the voice more furiously. And at once resuming its course, it passed by Saint-Sever, by the Quai des Grandiers, the Quai aux Moyles, once more over the bridge by the place to Champy Mars, and behind the hospital gardens, where old men in black coats were walking in the sun along the terrace all green with ivy. It went up the boulevard Bovary, along the boulevard Cauchois, then the whole of Montré-Boutet to the Deville Hills. It came back, and then, without any fixed plan or direction, wandered about at hazard. The cab was seen at St. Paul, at Lescure, at Montgargan, at La Rogue-Marc, and Place du Gaillard-Bois in la Rue Maladrerie, Rue de Nanderie, before Saint-Romain, Saint-Vivien, Saint-Maclou, Saint-Nicaise, in front of the customs, at the Ville Tour, the Trois Pipes, and the monumental cemetery. From time to time, the coachman, on his box, cast despairing eyes at the public houses. He could not understand what furious desire for locomotion urged these individuals never to wish to stop. He tried to now and then, and at once exclamations of anger burst forth behind him. Then he lashed his perspiring jades afresh, but indifferent to their jolting, running up against things here and there, not caring if he did, demoralized, and almost weeping with thirst, fatigue, and depression. And on the harbor, in the midst of the drays and casks, and in the streets, at the corners, the good folk opened large wonder-stricken eyes at this sight, so extraordinary in the provinces, a cab with blinds drawn, and which appeared thus constantly shut more closely than the tomb, and tossing about like a vessel. Once in the middle of the day, in the open country, just as the sun beat most fiercely against the old plated lanterns, a bared hand passed beneath the small blinds of yellow canvas, and threw out some scraps of paper that scattered in the wind, and farther off lighted like white butterflies on a field of red clover all in bloom. At about 6 o'clock the carriage stopped in a back street of the Beauvoisin quarter, and a woman got out, who walked with her veil down, and without turning her head. Chapter 2. On reaching the inn, Madame Bovary was surprised not to see the diligence. Hibbert, who had waited for her 53 minutes, had at last started. Yet nothing forced her to go, but she had given her word that she would return that same evening. Moreover, Charles expected her, and in her heart she felt already the cowardly docility that is for some women at once the chastisement and atonement of adultery. She packed her box quickly, paid her bill, took a cab in the yard, hurrying on the driver, urging him on every moment, inquiring about the time and the miles traversed. He succeeded in catching up the Hirondelle as it neared the first houses of Quincampoix. Hardly was she seated in her corner than she closed her eyes and opened them at the foot of the hill, when from afar she recognized Félicite, who was on the lookout in front of the farrier's shop. Hibbert pulled in his horses, and the servant, climbing up to the window, said mysteriously, "Madam, you must go at once to Monsieur Hamai. It's for something important." The village was silent as usual. At the corner of the streets were small pink heaps that smoked in the air, for this was the time for jam-making, and everyone at Yonville prepared his supply on the same day. But in front of the chemist's shop one might admire a far larger heap, and that surpassed the others with the superiority that a laboratory must have over ordinary stores, a general need over individual fancy. She went in. The large armchair was upset, and even the Finaldi Rouen lay on the ground outspread between two vessels. She pushed open the lobby door, and in the middle of the kitchen, amid brown jars full of picked currants, of powdered sugar and lump sugar, of the scales on the table, and of the pans on the fire, she saw all the Hamai, small and large, with aprons reaching to their shins, and with forks in their hands. Justine was standing up with bowed head, and the chemist was screaming, "Who told you to go and fetch it in the Capernaum? What is it? What is the matter?" "What is it?" replied the druggist. "We are making preserves, they are simmering, but they were about to boil over, because there is too much juice, and I ordered another pan. Then he, from indolence, from laziness, went and took, hanging on its nail in my laboratory, the key of the Capernaum. It was thus the druggist called a small room under the leads, full of the utensils and the goods of his trade. He often spent long hours there, alone, labeling, decanting, and doing up again, and he looked upon it not as a simple store but as a veritable sanctuary, whence there afterwards issued, elaborated by his hands, all sorts of pills, beluses, infusions, lotions and potions that would bear far and wide his celebrity. No one in the world set foot there, and he respected it so, that he swept it himself. Finally, if the pharmacy, open to all comers, was the spot where he displayed his pride, the Capernaum was the refuge where, egoistically concentrating himself, he delighted in the exercise of his predilections, so that Justin's thoughtlessness seemed to him a monstrous piece of irreverence, and rather than the currents, he repeated yes, from the Capernaum, the key that locks up the acids and caustic alkalis. To go and get a spare pan, a pan with a lid, and that I shall perhaps never use. Everything is of importance in the delicate operations of our art. But, devil take it, one must make distinctions and not employ for almost domestic purposes that which is meant for pharmaceutical. It is as if one were to carve a fowl with a scalpel, as if a magistrate Now be calm, said Madame Hermie. And Nathalie, pulling at his coat, cried, Papa! Papa! No, let me alone, went on the druggist, let me alone, hang it. My word. One might as well set up for a grocer. That's it. Go it. Respect. Nothing. Break, smash, let loose the leeches, burn the mellow paste, pickle the gherkins in the window jars, tear up the bandages. I thought you had said Emma. Presently. Do you know to what you exposed yourself? Didn't you see anything in the corner, on the left, on the third shelf? Speak, answer, articulate something. I don't single quotino, stammered the young fellow. You don't know. Well, then, I do know. You saw a bottle of blue glass, sealed with yellow wax, that contains a white powder on which I have even written dangerous. And do you know what is in it? Arsenic. And you go and touch it. You take a pan that was next to it. Next to it, cried Madame Hermie, clasping her hands. Arsenic. You might have poisoned us all. And the children began howling as if they already had frightful pains in their entrails. Or poison a patient, continued the druggist. Do you want to see me in the prisoner's dock with criminals, in a court of justice? To see me dragged to the scaffold? Don't you know what care I take in managing things, although I am so thoroughly used to it? Often I am horrified myself when I think of my responsibility, for the government persecutes us, and the absurd legislation that rules us is a veritable Damocles sword over our heads. Emma no longer dreamed of asking what they wanted her for, and the druggist went on in breathless phrases. That is your return for all the kindness we have shown you. That is how you recompense me for the really paternal care that I lavish on you. For without me, where would you be? What would you be doing? Who provides you with food, education, clothes, and all the means of figuring one day with honor in the ranks of society? But you must pull hard at the oar, if you're to do that, and get, as people say, callosities upon your hands. Fabricando fit faber age quod aegis. Asterisk. Asterisk. The worker lives by working, do what he will. He was so exasperated he quoted Latin. He would have quoted Chinese or Greenlandish had he known those two languages, for he was in one of those crises in which the whole soul shows indistinctly what it contains, like the ocean, which in the storm opens itself from the seaweeds on its shores down to the sands of its abysses. And he went on I am beginning to repent terribly of having taken you up. I should certainly have done better to have left you to rot in your poverty and the dirt in which you were born. Oh, you'll never be fit for anything but to herd animals with horns. You have no aptitude for science. You hardly know how to stick on a label. And there you are, dwelling with me, snug as a parson, living in clover, taking your ease. But Emma, turning to Madame Homais, I was told to come here. Oh, dear me, interrupted the good woman with a sad air. How am I to tell you? It is a misfortune. She could not finish. The druggist was thundering. Empty it. Clean it. Take it back. Be quick. And seizing Justin by the collar of his blouse, he shook a book out of his pocket. The lad stooped, but Homais was the quicker and, having picked up the volume, contemplated it with staring eyes and open mouth. Conjugal love, he said, slowly separating the two words. Very good. Very good. Very pretty. And illustrations. Oh, this is too much. Madame Homais came forward. No, do not touch it. The children wanted to look at the pictures. Leave the room, he said imperiously, and they went out. First he walked up and down with the open volume in his hand, rolling his eyes, choking, timid, apoplectic. Then he came straight to his pupil, and planting himself in front of him with crossed arms, Have you every vice, then, little wretch? Take care. You are on a downward path. Did not you reflect that this infamous book might fall in the hands of my children, kindle a spark in their minds, tarnish the purity of Italy, corrupt Napoleon? He is already formed like a man. Are you quite sure, anyhow, that they have not read it? Can you certify to me? But really, sir, said Emma, you wished to tell me? Yes, madam. Your father-in-law's dead. In fact, Monsieur Bovary Sr. had expired the evening before suddenly, from an attack of apoplexy as he got up from table, and by way of greater precaution, on account of Emma's sensibility, Charles had begged Homais to break the horrible news to her gradually. Homais had thought over his speech, he had rounded, polished it, made it rhythmical. It was a masterpiece of prudence and transitions, of subtle turns and delicacy, but anger had got the better of rhetoric. Emma, giving up all chance of hearing any details, left the pharmacy, for Monsieur Homais had taken up the thread of his vituperations. However, he was growing calmer, and was now grumbling in a paternal tone, whilst he fanned himself with his skullcap. It is not that I entirely disapprove of the work. Its author was a doctor. There are certain scientific points in it that it is not ill a man should know, and I would even venture to say that a man must know. But later. At any rate, not till you are man yourself and your temperament is formed. When Emma knocked at the door, Charles, who was waiting for her, came forward with open arms and said to her with tears in his voice, my dear. And he bent over her gently to kiss her. But at the contact of his lips, the memory of the other seized her, and she passed her hand over her face, shuddering. But she made answer, yes, I know. He showed her the letter in which his mother told the event without any sentimental hypocrisy. She only regretted her husband had not received the consolations of religion as he had died at Dogville in the street at the door of a cafe after a patriotic dinner with some ex-officers. Emma gave him back the letter. Then at dinner, for appearance's sake, she affected a certain repugnance. But as he urged her to try, she resolutely began eating, while Charles opposite her sat motionless in a dejected attitude. Now and then he raised his head and gave her a long look full of distress. Once he sighed. "I should have liked to see him again." She was silent. At last, understanding that she must say something. "How old was your father?" she asked. 58. And that was all. A quarter of an hour after he added, "My poor mother. What will become of her now?" She made a gesture that signified she did not know. Seeing her so taciturn, Charles imagined her much affected, and forced himself to say nothing, not to reawaken the sorrow which moved him. And shaking off his own dash, "Did you enjoy yourself yesterday?" he asked. "Yes." When the cloth was removed, Bovary did not rise, nor did Emma, and as she looked at him, the monotony of the spectacle drove little by little all pity from her heart. He seemed to her paltry, weak, a cipher in a word, a poor thing in every way. How to get rid of him? What an interminable evening! Something stupefying like the fumes of opium seized her. They heard in the passage the sharp noise of a wooden leg on the boards. It was Hippolyte bringing back Emma's luggage. In order to put it down, he described painfully a quarter of a circle with his stump. "He doesn't even remember any more about it," she thought, looking at the poor devil, whose coarse red hair was wet with perspiration. Bovary was searching at the bottom of his purse for a centime, and, without appearing to understand all there was of humiliation for him in the mere presence of this man, who stood there like a personified reproach to his incurable incapacity. "Hallo! You've a pretty bouquet," he said, noticing Leon's violets on the chimney. "Yes," she replied indifferently. "It's a bouquet I bought just now from a beggar." Charles picked up the flowers, and freshening his eyes, red with tears, against them, smelt them delicately. She took them quickly from his hand and put them in a glass of water. The next day Madame Bovary Senior arrived. She and her son wept much. Emma, on the pretext of giving orders, disappeared. The following day, they had to talk over the morning. They went and sat down with their work-boxes by the waterside under the arbor. Charles was thinking of his father, and was surprised to feel so much affection for this man, whom till then he had thought he cared little about. Madame Bovary Senior was thinking of her husband. The worst days of the past seemed enviable to her. All was forgotten beneath the instinctive regret of such a long habit, and from time to time whilst she sewed, a big tear rolled along her nose and hung suspended there a moment. Emma was thinking that it was scarcely 48 hours since they had been together, far from the world, all in a frenzy of joy, and not having eyes enough to gaze upon each other. She tried to recall the slightest details of that past day, but the presence of her husband and mother-in-law worried her. She would have liked to hear nothing, to see nothing, so as not to disturb the meditation on her love, that, do what she would, became lost in external sensations. She was unpicking the lining of a dress, and the strips were scattered around her. Madame Bovary Senior was plying her scissor without looking up, and Charles, and his lace slippers and his old brown surtout that he used as a dressing gown, sat with both hands in his pockets, and did not speak either. Near them Berthe, in the little white pinafore, was raking sand in the walks with her spade. Suddenly she saw Monsieur Leroux, the linen draper, coming through the gate. He came to offer his services under the sad circumstances. Emma answered that she thought she could do without. The shopkeeper was not to be beaten. "I beg your pardon," he said, "but I should like to have a private talk with you." Then in a low voice, "It's about that affair, you know." Charles crimsoned to his ears. "Oh, yes. Certainly." And in his confusion, turning to his wife, Couldn't you, my darling?" She seemed to understand him, for she rose and Charles said to his mother, "It is nothing particular. No doubt some household trifle." He did not want her to know the story of the bill, fearing her reproaches. As soon as they were alone, Monsieur Leroux in sufficiently clear terms began to congratulate Emma on the inheritance, then to talk of indifferent matters, of the Espaliers, of the harvest, and of his own health, which was always so-so, always having ups and downs. In fact, he had to work devilish hard, although he didn't make enough, in spite of all people said, to find butter for his bread. Emma let him talk on. She had bored herself so prodigiously the last 2 days. "And so you're quite well again," he went on. "Ma foi, I saw your husband in a sad state. He's a good fellow, though we did have a little misunderstanding." She asked what misunderstanding, for Charles had said nothing of the dispute about the goods supplied to her. "Why, you know well enough," cried Leroux. "It was about your little fancies, the traveling trunks." He had drawn his hat over his eyes and, with his hands behind his back, smiling and whistling, he looked straight at her in an unbearable manner. Did he suspect anything? She was lost in all kinds of apprehensions. At last, however, he went on. "We made it up all the same, and I've come again to propose another arrangement." This was to renew the bill Bovary had signed. The doctor, of course, would do as he pleased. He was not to trouble himself, especially just now, when he would have a lot of worry. And he would do better to give it over to someone else, to you, for example. With a power of attorney, it could be easily managed, and then you and I, would have our little business transactions together. She did not understand. He was silent. Then, passing to his trade, Leroux declared that Madame must require something. He would send her a black barège, 12 yards, just enough to make a gown. "The one you've on is good enough for the house, but you want another for calls. I saw that the very moment that I came in. I've the eye of an American." He did not send the stuff, he brought it. Then he came again to measure it. He came again on other pretexts, always trying to make himself agreeable, useful, offing himself, as I would have said, and always dropping some hint to Emma about the power of attorney. He never mentioned the bill. She did not think of it. Charles, at the beginning of her convalescence, had certainly said something about it to her, but so many emotions had passed through her head that she no longer remembered it. Besides, she took care not to talk of any money questions. Madame Bovary seemed surprised at this, and attributed the change in her ways to the religious sentiments she had contracted during her illness. But as soon as she was gone, Emma greatly astounded Bovary by her practical good sense. It would be necessary to make inquiries, to look into mortgages, and see if there were any occasion for a sale by auction, or a liquidation. She quoted technical terms casually, pronounced the grand words of order, the future, foresight, and constantly exaggerated the difficulties of settling his father's affairs, so much that at last, one day she showed him the rough draft of a power of attorney to manage and administer his business, arrange all loans, sign and endorse all bills, pay all sums, etc. She had profited by Leroux's lessons. Charles naively asked her where this paper came from. "Monsieur Guillaumin," and with the utmost coolness she added, "I don't trust him overmuch. Notaries have such a bad reputation. Perhaps we ought to consult. We only know no one." "Unless Leon replied Charles, who was reflecting. But it was difficult to explain matters by letter. Then she offered to make the journey, but he thanked her. She insisted. It was quite a contest of mutual consideration. At last she cried with affected waywardness, "No, I will go." How good you are," he said, kissing her forehead. The next morning she set out in the Hirondelle to go to Rouen to consult Monsieur Léon, and she stayed there 3 days. Chapter 3. They were 3 full, exquisite days, a true honeymoon. They were at the Hotel de Boulogne, on the harbor, and they lived there, with drawn blinds and closed doors, with flowers on the floor, and ice syrups were brought them early in the morning. Towards evening they took a covered boat and went to dine on one of the islands. It was the time when one hears by the side of the dockyard the clucking mallets sounding against the hull of vessels. The smoke of the tar rose up between the trees. There were large fatty drops on the water, undulating in the purple color of the sun, like floating plaques of Florentine bronze. They rowed down in the midst of moored boats, whose long oblique cables grazed lightly against the bottom of the boat. The din of the town gradually grew distant, the rolling of carriages, the tumult of voices, the yelping of dogs on the decks of vessels. She took off her bonnet, and they landed on their island. They sat down in the low-ceilinged room of a tavern, at whose door hung black nets. They ate fried smelts, cream and cherries. They lay down upon the grass, they kissed behind the poplars, and they would fain, like 2 Robinsons, have lived forever in this little place, which seemed to them in their beatitude the most magnificent on earth. It was not the first time that they had seen trees, a blue sky, meadows, that they had heard the water flowing and the wind blowing in the leaves, but, no doubt, they had never admired all this, as if nature had not existed before, or had only begun to be beautiful since the gratification of their desires. At night they returned. The boat glided along the shores of the islands. They sat at the bottom, both hidden by the shade, in silence. The square oars rang in the iron thwarts, and, in the stillness, seemed to mark time, like the beating of a metronome, while at the stern the rudder that trailed behind never ceased its gentle splash against the water. Once the moon rose, they did not fail to make fine phrases, finding the orb melancholy and full of poetry. She even began to sing one night, do you remember, we were sailing, etc. Her musical but weak voice died away along the waves, and the winds carried off the trills that Leon heard pass like the flapping of wings about him. She was opposite him, leaning against the partition of the chaloupe, through one of whose raised blinds the moon streamed in. Her black dress, whose drapery spread out like a fan, made her seem more slender, taller. Her head was raised, her hands clasped, her eyes turned towards heaven. At times the shadow of the willows hid her completely, then she reappeared suddenly, like a vision in the moonlight. Leon, on the floor by her side, found under his hand a ribbon of scarlet silk. The boatman looked at it, and at last said, perhaps it belongs to the party I took out the other day. A lot of jolly folk, gentlemen and ladies, with cakes, champagne, corns, everything in style. There was one especially, a tall handsome man with small mustaches who was that funny. And they all kept saying, no tell us something, Adolphe Dolp, I think. She shivered. You are in pain? Asked Leon, coming closer to her. Oh, it's nothing. No doubt it is only the night air. And who doesn't want for women, either, softly added the sailor, thinking he was paying the stranger a compliment. Then, spitting on his hands, he took the oars again. Yet they had to part. The audio were sad. He was to send his letters to Mirolette, and she gave him such precise instructions about the double envelope that he admired greatly her amorous astuteness. So you can assure me it is all right, she said with her last kiss. Yes, certainly. But why, he thought afterwards as he came back through the streets, alone, is she so very anxious to get this power of attorney? Chapter 4. Leon soon put on an air of superiority before his comrades, avoided their company and completely neglected his work. He waited for her letters, he reread them, he wrote to her. He called her to mind with all the strength of his desires and of his memories. Instead of lessening with absence, this longing to see her again grew so that at last on Saturday morning he escaped from his office. When, from the summit of the hill, he saw in the valley below the church spire with its tin flag swinging in the wind, he felt that delight mingled with triumphant vanity and egoistic tenderness that millionaires must experience when they come back to their native village. He went rambling round her house. A light was burning in the kitchen. He watched for her shadow behind the curtains, but nothing appeared. Mère Lefrançois, when she saw him, uttered many exclamations. She thought he had grown and was thinner, while Artemis, on the contrary, thought him stouter and darker. He dined in the little room as of yore, but alone, without the tax-gatherer, for Bonnet, tired of waiting for the Hirondelle, had definitely put forward his meal 1 hour, and now he dined punctually at 5, and yet he declared usually the rickety old concern was late. Leon, however, made up his mind and knocked at the doctor's door. Madame was in her room and did not come down for a quarter of an hour. The doctor seemed delighted to see him, but he never stirred out that evening, nor all the next day. He saw her alone in the evening, very late, behind the garden in the lane as she had the other one. It was a stormy night, and they talked under an umbrella by lightning flashes. Their separation was becoming intolerable. "I would rather die," said Emma. She was writhing in his arms, weeping. "Adieu. Adieu. When shall I see you again?" They came back again to embrace once more, and it was then that she promised him to find soon, by no matter what means, a regular opportunity for seeing one another in freedom at least once a week. Emma never doubted she should be able to do this. Besides, she was full of hope. Some money was coming to her. On the strength of it she bought a pair of yellow curtains with large stripes for her room, whose cheapness Monsieur Leroux had commended. She dreamed of getting a carpet, and Leroux, declaring that it wasn't drinking the sea, politely undertook to supply her with one. She could no longer do without his services. 20 times a day she sent for him, and he at once put by his business without a murmur. People could not understand either why Miroulet breakfasted with her every day, and even paid her private visits. It was about this time, that is to say, the beginning of winter, that she seemed seized with great musical fervor. One evening when Charles was listening to her, she began the same piece 4 times over, each time with much vexation, while he, not noticing any difference, cried dash. "Bravo! Very good, you are wrong to stop. Go on." "Oh, no, it is execrable. My fingers are quite rusty." The next day he begged her to play him something again. "Very well, to please you." And Charles confessed she had gone off a little. She played wrong notes, and blundered, then, stopping short dash. It is no use. I ought to take some lessons, but dash she bit her lips, and added, 20 francs a lesson, that's too dear." "Yes, so it is rather," said Charles, giggling stupidly. "But it seems to me that one might be able to do it for less, for there are artists of no reputation, and who are often better than the celebrities." "Find them," said Emma. The next day when he came home he looked at her shyly, and at last could no longer keep back the words. "How obstinate you are sometimes. I went to Berfeuchères today. Well, Madame Lagarde assured me that her 3 young ladies who are at Le Misère could have lessons at 50 sous apiece, and that from an excellent mistress." She shrugged her shoulders and did not open her piano again. But when she passed by it, if Bovary were there, she sighed dash. Ah, my poor piano. And when anyone came to see her, she did not fail to inform them she had given up music and could not begin again now for important reasons. Then people commiserated her. What a pity. She had so much talent. They even spoke to Bovary about it. They put him to shame, and especially the chemist. You are wrong. One should never let any of the faculties of nature lie fallow. Besides, just think, my good friend, that by inducing Madame to study, you are economizing on the subsequent musical education of your child. For my own part, I think that mothers ought themselves to instruct their children. That is an idea of Rousseau's, still rather new perhaps, but that will end by triumphing, I am certain of it, like mothers nursing their own children and vaccination. So Charles returned once more to this question of the piano. Emma replied bitterly that it would be better to sell it. This poor piano, that had given her vanity so much satisfaction to see it go, was to Bovary like the indefinable suicide of a part of herself. If you liked, he said, a lesson from time to time, that wouldn't, after all, be very ruinous. But lessons, she replied, are only of use when followed up. And thus it was she set about obtaining her husband's permission to go to town once a week to see her lover. At the end of a month she was even considered to have made considerable progress.